In the year 48 BCE, as Julius Caesar's ships burned in Alexandria's harbor, something far more catastrophic was unfolding just blocks away. The flames that began as a military tactic spread with terrifying speed, consuming not just enemy vessels but leaping across the docks, racing through the streets, and finally reaching the most sacred building in the ancient world. For 9 centuries, this institution had stood as humanity's greatest treasure house of knowledge. Within its walls lay the collected wisdom of every civilization from India to Britain, from Babylon to the far reaches of Africa. But on that fateful night, as smoke billowed through corridors lined with countless scrolls, the world lost something it would never recover. Not just a library, but the very memory of what we once knew. The Library of Alexandria wasn't simply a collection of books. It was the beating heart of human knowledge, a place where the greatest minds of antiquity gathered to push the boundaries of science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. And when it burned, entire fields of understanding vanished forever. Have you ever wondered what secrets were locked away in those scrolls? What discoveries might have changed the course of human history if they had survived? What did we lose when the flames consumed centuries of accumulated wisdom? Tonight, we're going to step through the smoke and ash of history to uncover what was truly inside the most legendary library ever built. This isn't just another story about ancient books gathering dust. This is about the moment humanity stumbled backward into darkness, and why the echoes of that loss still haunt us today. Because what disappeared in Alexandria wasn't just parchment and ink. It was the roadmap to a future we never got to see. The Great Library of Alexandria was more than an institution. It was an obsession. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't just claim territory, he claimed the right to collect all human knowledge under one roof. His general Ptolemy, who would become the first Ptolemy to rule Egypt, understood that true power didn't come from armies alone. It came from knowing what everyone else knew, and then knowing more. The Ptolemies turned knowledge into a weapon. They established a rule that would make modern copyright lawyers weep. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched, not for contraband or weapons, but for books. Every scroll, every manuscript, every written document was confiscated, copied by teams of scribes, and then the copies were returned to the owners. The originals stayed in Alexandria forever. Imagine arriving in Alexandria as a merchant from Athens, carrying precious scrolls of poetry or philosophy to trade in distant lands. You dock at the harbor, expecting routine customs inspection, only to watch officials systematically strip your cargo of every written word. Days later, you receive back what appear to be your documents, but they're copies. The originals, the authentic works touched by the hands of great thinkers, now belong to the library. You've been robbed, but it was legal. It was policy. It was genius. This wasn't just collection. This was systematic cultural appropriation on an unprecedented scale. The Ptolemies didn't care about the feelings of foreign merchants or the concept of intellectual property. They cared about creating the most comprehensive repository of human knowledge the world had ever seen, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But the harbor searches were just the beginning. The library sent agents across the known world with one mission: acquire everything. They purchased entire private libraries from wealthy collectors. They commissioned translations of works written in languages their scholars couldn't read. They offered enormous sums for single copies of rare texts. If a book existed anywhere in the Mediterranean world, the Library of Alexandria wanted it. The result was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the library contained between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its peak. But numbers don't tell the full story. What matters isn't how many scrolls filled those shelves, but what was written on them. Because inside the Library of Alexandria, humanity had assembled the most extraordinary collection of knowledge ever gathered in one place. The mathematics section alone would have made modern universities weep with envy. Here were the original works of Euclid, the master of geometry whose theorems still form the foundation of mathematical education today. But these weren't just copies of copies, passed down through centuries of scribes. These were the authentic manuscripts, written in Euclid's own hand or dictated to his students. Imagine holding a scroll where Euclid first proved that the angles of a triangle always sum to 180 degrees. Imagine reading his margin notes, his corrections, his moments of breakthrough written in fresh ink. Alongside Euclid's geometry were the revolutionary works of Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of the ancient world. His treatises on calculus, written nearly 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz would independently rediscover the same principles, sat on those shelves. His mechanical innovations, his theories of physics, his calculations of pi accurate to degrees that wouldn't be matched for centuries, all preserved in the original Greek. But the mathematical treasures went far beyond Greek achievements. The library held Sanskrit texts from India describing numerical systems that wouldn't reach Europe for another 1,000 years. Babylonian astronomical calculations of stunning accuracy. Egyptian geometric principles used in pyramid construction. Chinese mathematical treatises that explored concepts Western scholars wouldn't encounter until the Renaissance. Every scroll represented not just individual genius, but the accumulated knowledge of entire civilizations. The library hadn't just collected books, it had collected the mathematical DNA of human civilization. The medical section would have put modern hospitals to shame. Here were the complete works of Hippocrates, the father of medicine, including texts that have been lost to history. His detailed observations of diseases, his systematic approach to diagnosis, his ethical guidelines for physicians, all preserved in their original form. But Hippocrates was just the beginning. The library housed surgical manuals from ancient Egypt describing procedures that wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. Detailed anatomical drawings showing the human body with an accuracy that suggests ancient physicians had access to cadavers for dissection, a practice that would be banned in medieval Europe. Pharmaceutical texts listing hundreds of medicinal plants, their properties, their preparations, their dosages. From India came Ayurvedic texts describing holistic approaches to health that integrated mind, body, and spirit. From Babylon came diagnostic techniques that could identify diseases by examining patterns in the patient's breath, urine, and skin. From Persia came surgical instruments and techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. But perhaps most remarkably, the library contained medical texts that described treatments for conditions that wouldn't be formally recognized by Western medicine for centuries. Depression, anxiety, what we now call PTSD, all were documented with sophisticated understanding of both symptoms and treatments. The ancient world wasn't primitive. In many ways, it was more advanced than we've been taught to believe. The astronomy section would have made NASA jealous. Here were the calculations of Aristarchus, who correctly theorized that the Earth orbited the Sun nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus shocked medieval Europe with the same idea. His measurements of the size and distance of the Sun and Moon, remarkably accurate given the primitive instruments available, were preserved in their original form. The library held star charts of breathtaking precision, created by astronomers who understood that the heavens followed predictable patterns. Babylonian astronomers had calculated the length of the year to within minutes of modern measurements. Egyptian astronomers had mapped the night sky with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope. But the real treasure was the theoretical work. Ancient astronomers didn't just observe and calculate. They theorized. They understood that the universe was vast, potentially infinite. They calculated the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy. They predicted eclipses decades in advance. They understood that the Milky Way was composed of distant stars, not a river of light painted across the sky. Greek astronomers like Eratosthenes had calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis, the distance to the Sun, and the size of the Moon using nothing but shadows and geometry. Their work was so advanced that medieval European scholars, lacking access to these texts, would spend centuries trying to rediscover knowledge that had been common in Alexandria. The engineering section contained blueprints for machines that wouldn't be reinvented for centuries. Hero of Alexandria had created the first steam engine, a device that could have launched the Industrial Revolution 500 years early if anyone had recognized its potential. His pneumatic devices, his automated systems, his understanding of mechanical principles were all documented in meticulous detail. Ancient engineers had developed water clocks of extraordinary precision, capable of keeping time as accurately as medieval European clocks. They had created mechanical calculators, devices that could perform complex mathematical operations using nothing but gears and wheels. They had designed siege engines, architectural tools, and manufacturing equipment that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of physics and mechanics. But perhaps most intriguingly, the library contained descriptions of inventions that seem almost supernatural by ancient standards. Automatic doors that opened when approaching. Mechanical theaters where figures moved and spoke without human intervention. Devices that could calculate astronomical positions decades in advance. The ancient world wasn't just advanced. In some ways, it was approaching the technological sophistication of the Renaissance. The philosophy section was perhaps the most dangerous collection in the library. Here were works that challenged every assumption about religion, politics, and human nature. Complete manuscripts of pre-Socratic philosophers who had theorized about atomic structure, evolutionary development, and the nature of consciousness. Texts that wouldn't just contradict medieval Christian doctrine, but would provide alternative frameworks for understanding existence itself. The library held the complete works of philosophers whose names have been lost to history. Thinkers who might have been greater than Plato or Aristotle, but whose ideas survived only in Alexandria. Democratic theories that wouldn't resurface until the Enlightenment. Concepts of individual rights that preceded the Magna Carta by centuries. Social contracts that imagined governments serving the people rather than ruling them. But the philosophical treasures extended far beyond Greek thought. Buddhist texts from India exploring consciousness and reality with sophistication that wouldn't be matched by Western philosophy until the 20th century. Confucian political theory that offered alternatives to both monarchy and democracy. Zoroastrian ethical systems that influenced but then disappeared from Western thought. These weren't just academic exercises. These were revolutionary ideas that could have changed the course of human history. Ideas about the nature of reality, the purpose of government, the rights of individuals, the relationship between mind and matter. Ideas that were preserved in Alexandria, but would take centuries to rediscover after the library's destruction. The historical section contained the memory of the ancient world, complete chronicles of civilizations that have since vanished from human memory. Detailed accounts of the sea peoples who terrorized the Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. Records of African kingdoms that traded with Rome and Greece. Histories of Celtic tribes, Germanic peoples, and Scythian nomads written by those who actually encountered them. But these weren't just political histories. The library contained social histories that described daily life in ancient civilizations with vivid detail. How people dressed, what they ate, how they celebrated, how they mourned. Economic histories that traced trade routes and commercial practices. Cultural histories that preserved languages, customs, and beliefs that would otherwise be lost forever. The library held the complete works of historians whose names we know only from fragments. Manetho's Complete History of Egypt, spanning 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. Berossus's Comprehensive Chronicle of Mesopotamian Civilization, texts that would have given us a complete picture of the ancient world, not just the Greek and Roman perspectives that survived. As we stand in the shadow of what was lost, the scale of the catastrophe becomes clear. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building full of books. It was the memory of human civilization, the accumulated wisdom of every culture that had contributed to the Mediterranean world. When it burned, we didn't just lose information, we lost entire ways of thinking, entire approaches to understanding the world. But what exactly happened to all this knowledge? How did the greatest collection of human wisdom in history disappear? And more importantly, what specific treasures were lost in those flames? The answers are more complex and more tragic than most people realize. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow death, a gradual bleeding of knowledge that took place over centuries. But understanding what was lost requires us to dig deeper into the specific collections, the individual scrolls, the particular discoveries that vanished forever when the ancient world collapsed into darkness. Because what disappeared in Alexandria wasn't just the past, it was the future. A future where human knowledge built upon itself instead of being repeatedly rediscovered. A future where the wisdom of all civilizations combined to push the boundaries of what was possible. A future we're still trying to reclaim. The poetry section alone would have driven Renaissance scholars to madness with envy. Here were the complete works of Sappho, the legendary poet of Lesbos, whose fragments today tantalize us with their beauty and leave us desperate for more. But in Alexandria, there was more. Much more. 9 complete books of her poetry, thousands of lines that captured the human heart with an intensity that made grown men weep. Her love poems, her wedding songs, her hymns to the gods, all preserved in their original Greek, written in her own distinctive meter that later poets would struggle to imitate. But Sappho was merely one voice in a chorus of lost literature. The library contained the complete works of Aeschylus, not just the 7 plays that survived the medieval period, but all 90 tragedies he wrote. Imagine having access to the full scope of his genius, seeing how his dramatic techniques evolved, reading the plays that influenced Sophocles and Euripides but were lost to time. The library held the complete cycles of Greek epic poetry, works that made the Iliad and Odyssey look like brief sketches of a much larger canvas. From Rome came the complete works of poets whose names we know only from references in other texts. Ennius, the father of Roman poetry, whose epic annales survived in fragments but existed in full within those walls. Naevius, whose satirical attacks on Roman politicians were so sharp they landed him in prison. Axius, whose tragedies were said to rival those of the Greeks, but whose works vanished with the library's destruction. But the real treasure was the poetry from civilizations that have left barely a trace in our historical record. Epic poems from Scythian bards, describing the vast steppes and the horse-riding peoples who dominated them. Love songs from Nubian kingdoms that flourished along the Nile. Heroic ballads from Celtic tribes that wouldn't be written down elsewhere for centuries. The library had collected the songs of humanity, the voices that captured what it meant to be human in ages we can barely imagine. The religious texts housed in Alexandria would have rewritten the history of human spirituality. Here were the complete sacred writings of mystery cults that offered alternative paths to salvation and enlightenment. The Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysiac rites, the Orphic traditions, all preserved in their original forms with their deepest secrets intact. These weren't just academic curiosities. These were living religious traditions that offered profound spiritual experiences to their initiates. The library contained the complete works of Gnostic teachers whose ideas would later be suppressed by mainstream Christianity. Texts that described direct personal experience of the divine, that taught techniques for achieving mystical states, that offered radically different interpretations of existence and consciousness. These works wouldn't just contradict later Christian doctrine. They would provide entirely different frameworks for understanding the relationship between human and divine. From Egypt came the complete corpus of Hermetic texts, magical and philosophical works, attributed to Thoth, the god of wisdom. These weren't just spells and incantations. They were sophisticated philosophical systems that integrated magic, science, and spirituality into coherent worldviews. The medieval Islamic scholars who preserved fragments of these texts would build entire intellectual traditions around them. But perhaps most remarkably, the library contained religious texts from traditions that have completely vanished from human memory. Sacred writings from African kingdoms that described spiritual practices involving trance states and divine possession. Mystical texts from Indian traditions that explored consciousness with scientific precision. Shamanic traditions from Northern Europe that used altered states of consciousness for healing and prophecy. The technology section would have launched the scientific revolution 1,000 years early. Here were the complete works of Ctesibius, the father of pneumatics, whose inventions included the first organ, the first fire engine, and mechanical devices that operated on principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. His detailed blueprints, his theoretical explanations, his step-by-step instructions for building complex machines, all preserved in meticulous detail. The library held the complete works of Apollodorus, whose treatises on siege warfare included designs for mechanical artillery that wouldn't be matched until the invention of gunpowder. His torsion engines, his stone-throwing machines, his defensive systems were so advanced that Roman engineers would spend centuries trying to replicate them. But the technological treasures went far beyond military applications. The library contained detailed descriptions of manufacturing processes that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Industrial Revolution. Techniques for working metals, for creating alloys, for mass-producing goods with consistent quality. Ancient engineers had developed water-powered mills, mechanical looms, and precision instruments that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of physics and engineering. From China came descriptions of paper-making techniques that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. From India came metallurgical processes that produced steel of extraordinary quality. From Persia came architectural techniques that allowed the construction of massive domes and vaults. The library had collected the industrial secrets of the ancient world, knowledge that could have transformed human civilization if it had survived. The geographical section contained maps and travel accounts that would have revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. Here were the complete works of explorers who had traveled to the edges of the known world and beyond. Detailed accounts of journeys to India, China, and the lands beyond. Maps showing trade routes, natural resources, and political boundaries with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the age of exploration. The library held the complete works of Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to India, whose detailed account of the Mauryan Empire provided the most comprehensive description of ancient Indian civilization. His observations of Indian society, religion, and politics were so detailed that later historians would rely on them for centuries. But his complete works, with their wealth of detail about a civilization at its peak, were lost with the library. From Africa came accounts of expeditions down the Nile, across the Sahara, and along the coast of the continent. These weren't just travel narratives. They were systematic geographical surveys that documented natural resources, trade opportunities, and political structures. The library contained maps of African kingdoms that wouldn't be rediscovered by European explorers until the 19th century. But perhaps most intriguingly, the library contained accounts of journeys that pushed the boundaries of what we think was possible in the ancient world. Descriptions of voyages to lands that sound remarkably like the Americas. Accounts of Arctic expeditions that described phenomena that wouldn't be officially documented until modern times. Maps showing continents and islands that shouldn't have been known to ancient geographers. The medical section would have prevented the dark ages of medicine that followed the library's destruction. Here were surgical texts that described procedures with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. Cataract surgery, brain surgery, cesarean sections, all documented with detailed illustrations and step-by-step instructions. Ancient physicians had developed anesthetics, antiseptics, and surgical instruments that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. The library contained the complete works of Herophilus, the father of anatomy, whose dissections of human cadavers had produced the most accurate understanding of human physiology in the ancient world. His detailed descriptions of the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the digestive system were so precise that medieval physicians, lacking access to his works, would spend centuries trying to understand what he had already explained. But the medical treasures extended far beyond surgery and anatomy. The library held pharmacological texts that described thousands of medicinal plants, their properties, their preparations, and their applications. Ancient physicians had developed treatments for diseases that wouldn't be formally recognized by Western medicine until the modern era. Depression, anxiety, what we now call autoimmune disorders, all were documented with sophisticated understanding of both symptoms and treatments. From India came Ayurvedic texts that described holistic approaches to health that integrated diet, exercise, meditation, and herbal medicine. From China came acupuncture texts that mapped the body's energy systems with precision that still guides modern practitioners. From Egypt came surgical papyri that described procedures and treatments that were centuries ahead of their time. The mathematical section contained discoveries that would have accelerated human progress by centuries. Here were the complete works of Apollonius, whose studies of conic sections laid the groundwork for later discoveries in astronomy and physics. His detailed geometric proofs, his innovative techniques, his theoretical insights were so advanced that medieval mathematicians, lacking access to his works, would struggle to understand concepts he had mastered. The library held the complete works of Diophantus, the father of algebra, whose techniques for solving complex equations wouldn't be rediscovered until the Islamic Golden Age. His systematic approach to mathematical problems, his innovative notation, his theoretical frameworks were so sophisticated that they influenced mathematical development for centuries. But perhaps most remarkably, the library contained mathematical texts that described concepts that wouldn't be formally developed until the modern era. Infinite series, differential equations, probability theory, all explored by ancient mathematicians with a sophistication that suggests they were approaching the boundaries of pure mathematics. The astronomical section would have prevented the scientific stagnation that followed the library's destruction. Here were the complete works of Hipparchus, the greatest astronomer of the ancient world, whose star catalogue contained over 850 stars mapped with extraordinary precision. His discovery of the precession of the equinoxes, his accurate calculations of the length of the year, his systematic approach to astronomical observation were so advanced that medieval astronomers would spend centuries trying to replicate his achievements. But the astronomical treasures went far beyond Greek achievements. The library contained Babylonian astronomical texts that predicted eclipses with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the invention of modern computers. Egyptian astronomical papyri that described the movements of the planets with mathematical precision. Indian astronomical texts that describe the universe in terms that sound remarkably modern. As we catalog these losses, the true scope of the catastrophe becomes clear. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a repository of ancient knowledge. It was the launching pad for human civilization, the place where the accumulated wisdom of all cultures was being synthesized into something greater than the sum of its parts. When it was destroyed, we didn't just lose books. We lost the momentum of human progress itself. But the destruction of the library wasn't just a historical accident. It was the result of specific forces, particular decisions, and identifiable moments when the ancient world chose ignorance over wisdom. Understanding how this catastrophe unfolded reveals not just what we lost, but why we lost it, and perhaps most importantly, what we can still recover from the ashes of history. The decline of the Library of Alexandria began long before the flames consumed its scrolls. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, each one deeper than the last, each one bringing humanity closer to the abyss of ignorance that would define the centuries to come. The first cut came in 145 BCE, when the Ptolemaic dynasty began to crumble from within. Political instability wasn't just an inconvenience for the library. It was a death sentence. The Ptolemies had built their reputation on being the guardians of knowledge, the patrons of learning who attracted the greatest minds of the ancient world. But as civil wars erupted and rival claimants fought for the throne, the library's funding dried up like water in the desert. Scholars began to flee. The great minds who had once competed for the honor of working in Alexandria started accepting positions in Rhodes, Athens, and Pergamon. The brain drain was catastrophic. Imagine Harvard, MIT, and Stanford all losing their best professors simultaneously. That was what happened to Alexandria, but on a scale that would cripple human progress for centuries. The library's collection began to deteriorate. Without sufficient funds to maintain the scrolls, precious papyri started to rot in the humid Mediterranean climate. The copying programs that had once ensured multiple versions of every text were abandoned. For the first time in centuries, unique works existed in only one copy. When those copies were damaged or lost, entire fields of knowledge vanished forever. But the political chaos was just the beginning. The real killer was something far more insidious: the slow strangulation of intellectual freedom. As the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened, new powers emerged with very different ideas about the value of knowledge. The Roman Empire, which would eventually absorb Egypt, had a complicated relationship with learning. They respected practical knowledge, engineering, and military science. But they were deeply suspicious of philosophy, mathematics, and theoretical inquiry. Roman administrators began to view the library not as a treasure house of human wisdom, but as a potential source of sedition. Why did scholars need to know about alternative forms of government? Why were they studying foreign religions? Why were they questioning the natural order of things? The Romans didn't burn books, but they did something arguably worse. They stopped caring about them. The intellectual climate grew increasingly hostile. Scholars who had once debated freely about the nature of reality found themselves watching their words, avoiding topics that might be considered subversive. The library's famous symposiums, where thinkers from across the Mediterranean would gather to challenge each other's ideas, became rare, and then stopped entirely. Knowledge wasn't just being lost, it was being actively discouraged. Christianity's rise brought a new kind of threat to the library's treasures. Early Christian leaders weren't inherently opposed to learning, but they were fiercely opposed to pagan wisdom. The library's vast collection of religious texts from mystery cults, its philosophical works that contradicted Christian doctrine, its scientific treatises that challenged biblical cosmology, all became targets for destruction or suppression. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Christian scholars began to sort through the library's collections, deciding which works were compatible with their faith and which were dangerous. Mathematical and medical texts were generally preserved, but philosophy, astronomy, and religious studies were heavily censored. Entire sections of the library were declared off-limits to Christian scholars, and since Christians were rapidly becoming the dominant intellectual class, this meant vast areas of human knowledge became inaccessible. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: the rise of Islamic scholarship. When Arab armies conquered Egypt in 641 CE, they found a library that was already a shadow of its former self. The great collection that had once contained 700,000 scrolls had been reduced to perhaps 40,000 volumes, many of them damaged or incomplete. The Islamic conquerors faced a dilemma that would haunt humanity for centuries. They recognized the value of the library's remaining treasures, but they also faced practical constraints. The library building itself was crumbling, the papyri were deteriorating, and there weren't enough skilled translators to preserve everything. Difficult decisions had to be made about what to save and what to let perish. The Islamic scholars made choices that would reshape human knowledge. They prioritized works that seemed immediately useful: medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, and philosophical works that didn't directly contradict Islamic doctrine. But they had to abandon vast areas of the collection: poetry, history, religious texts from other traditions, and theoretical works that seemed impractical were allowed to decay. The translation movement that followed was both a salvation and a tragedy. Islamic scholars worked tirelessly to translate the library's surviving Greek texts into Arabic, preserving crucial works that would otherwise have been lost forever. But translation is always imperfect. Subtle meanings were lost, cultural contexts were stripped away, and the original Greek texts were often discarded once the Arabic translations were complete. What emerged was a filtered version of ancient knowledge. Islamic scholars preserved the works that fit their worldview and their practical needs, but they couldn't preserve everything. The diversity of ancient thought, the multiplicity of approaches to understanding reality, the sheer breadth of human curiosity that had once filled the library's halls, all were reduced to a more manageable but much narrower collection. The final destruction came not from flames or armies, but from simple neglect. As the Islamic world developed its own centers of learning in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, Alexandria became a backwater. The remaining scrolls were scattered to private collections, sold to dealers, or simply left to rot in abandoned buildings. The great library didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper, dissolving into history like morning mist. But what exactly did we lose in this slow-motion catastrophe? The answer isn't just about specific books or individual discoveries. It's about the loss of something far more precious: the continuity of human knowledge. When the library thrived, each generation of scholars built upon the work of their predecessors. Discoveries accumulated like compound interest, each breakthrough enabling the next leap forward. The library's destruction broke that chain. Instead of building upon ancient achievements, medieval scholars had to rediscover them from scratch. The mathematical insights of Archimedes were lost and then painfully reconstructed. The astronomical observations of Hipparchus were forgotten and then slowly pieced together from fragments. The medical knowledge of Herophilus was abandoned and then gradually recovered through trial and error. Imagine if modern science had to start over from the beginning every few centuries. Imagine if each generation of physicists had to rediscover the laws of motion. If each generation of doctors had to rediscover the circulation of blood. If each generation of mathematicians had to rediscover calculus. That's what happened to human civilization after the library's destruction. We entered a cycle of perpetual rediscovery, making the same breakthroughs over and over again instead of moving forward to new frontiers. The specific losses are staggering when you consider them individually. The complete works of Aristarchus, whose heliocentric theory predated Copernicus by nearly 18 centuries, were lost forever. His mathematical proofs, his observational data, his theoretical framework for understanding planetary motion all vanished. When Copernicus finally rediscovered that the Earth orbited the Sun, he had to start from scratch, using primitive instruments and incomplete observations. The surgical texts of Herophilus, which described brain surgery and cataract removal with startling sophistication, were lost for over 1,000 years. Medieval physicians, lacking access to his detailed anatomical knowledge, performed crude procedures that killed more patients than they saved. The precision and understanding that ancient surgeons had achieved through careful study and practice had to be painfully relearned through centuries of trial and error. The engineering manuals of Ctesibius, whose steam-powered devices could have launched the Industrial Revolution 15 centuries early, were lost just as completely. His detailed blueprints, his theoretical explanations, his practical instructions for building complex machines, all disappeared. When steam power was finally rediscovered in the 18th century, inventors had to solve problems that had already been solved, overcome obstacles that had already been conquered. But perhaps the most tragic loss was in the field of mathematics. The library contained works that pushed the boundaries of pure mathematics to levels that wouldn't be reached again until the modern era. Ancient mathematicians had developed sophisticated techniques for solving complex equations, had explored concepts of infinity and infinitesimals, had created geometric proofs of extraordinary elegance. When these works were lost, mathematics stagnated for centuries. The astronomical losses were equally devastating. Ancient astronomers had mapped the heavens with extraordinary precision, had developed theories about the structure of the universe that were remarkably accurate, had created instruments for observation that were centuries ahead of their time. The library contained star catalogs that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope, mathematical models that predicted celestial events with startling accuracy, theoretical frameworks that could have revolutionized our understanding of the cosmos. The medical knowledge that vanished with the library represents one of the greatest setbacks in human history. Ancient physicians had developed treatments for diseases that wouldn't be formally recognized again until the 20th century. They had surgical techniques that were lost for over a millennium. They had pharmacological knowledge that encompassed thousands of medicinal plants and their applications. When this knowledge was lost, human suffering increased exponentially. The philosophical works that burned in Alexandria contained ideas that could have changed the course of human thought. Alternative theories of government, innovative approaches to ethics, sophisticated analyses of consciousness and reality, all were lost. The diversity of ancient philosophical thought was reduced to a few surviving works. creating an intellectual monoculture that would dominate Western thought for centuries. The historical works that perished represented the memory of entire civilizations. Complete chronicles of kingdoms that have vanished from human consciousness, detailed accounts of peoples who left no other record of their existence, comprehensive analyses of ancient societies and their achievements. When these works were lost, entire chapters of human history were erased. The geographical knowledge that disappeared included maps and travel accounts that documented the full extent of ancient exploration. The library contained evidence of journeys to the far corners of the earth, descriptions of lands and peoples that wouldn't be discovered again for centuries, detailed accounts of trade routes and commercial networks that spanned continents. The religious texts that were lost represented the full spectrum of human spiritual experience. Mystery traditions that offered alternative paths to enlightenment, mystical practices that explored consciousness with scientific rigor, theological frameworks that provided different ways of understanding the divine. When these texts were destroyed, human spirituality was impoverished. The technological knowledge that vanished included innovations that were centuries ahead of their time, mechanical devices that operated on principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, manufacturing techniques that could have transformed ancient economies, architectural methods that created structures of unprecedented scale and beauty. The literary works that burned represented the voices of entire civilizations, epic poems that chronicled the deeds of forgotten heroes, love songs that captured the human heart with timeless beauty, dramatic works that explored the depths of human nature with psychological insight. When these works were lost, entire literary traditions vanished. The cumulative effect of these losses was catastrophic. Humanity didn't just lose individual works or specific discoveries. We lost the momentum of intellectual progress itself. The library had been the engine of human advancement, the place where knowledge from all civilizations was synthesized into something greater than the sum of its parts. When that engine was destroyed, human civilization shifted into reverse. The medieval period that followed has been called the Dark Ages, and while that term is somewhat unfair, it captures something essential about what happened after the library's destruction. It wasn't that people became stupid or stopped thinking. It was that they lost access to the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors. They had to start over, rediscovering truths that had already been known, solving problems that had already been solved. The Renaissance was essentially a recovery program, an attempt to reconstruct what had been lost. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered ancient Greek texts, they weren't making new discoveries. They were recovering old ones. The new learning of the Renaissance was actually very old learning that had been forgotten and then painfully reconstructed. The scientific revolution that followed was similarly a process of recovery as much as discovery. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw the moons of Jupiter, he was confirming observations that ancient astronomers had made with the naked eye. When Newton developed his laws of motion, he was formalizing principles that ancient mathematicians had understood intuitively. When Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, he was rediscovering knowledge that ancient physicians had possessed. This pattern of loss and recovery has continued into the modern era. Archaeological discoveries regularly reveal that ancient civilizations were far more sophisticated than we had assumed. Ancient computers, precision instruments, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated mathematics, all are being rediscovered as we slowly piece together what was lost when the library burned. But the tragedy isn't just that we lost specific knowledge, it's that we lost time. The centuries spent rediscovering what was already known could have been spent pushing the boundaries of human understanding even further. If the library had survived, if the continuity of knowledge had been maintained, where would we be now? What problems would we have solved? What mysteries would we have unraveled? The loss of the Library of Alexandria represents more than a historical tragedy. It represents a warning about the fragility of human knowledge and the importance of preserving it for future generations. Because what happened in Alexandria could happen again. Knowledge is always vulnerable to destruction, whether from war, natural disaster, or simple neglect. But understanding what was lost also provides hope. Because if ancient civilizations could achieve such heights of learning with primitive tools and limited resources, imagine what we might accomplish with modern technology and global cooperation. The library's destruction may have set back human progress by centuries, but it didn't stop it. The flame of knowledge, once lit, can never be completely extinguished. The scrolls may have burned, but the ideas they contained live on in fragments and echoes. Every time a modern scientist makes a discovery, every time a scholar uncovers a new truth, every time a student learns something new, they are continuing the work that began in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. The library is gone, but its spirit endures. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Knowledge isn't just information stored in books or scrolls. It's a living thing, passed from teacher to student, from generation to generation, from civilization to civilization. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but the human hunger for knowledge that created it remains as strong as ever. The flames that consumed those ancient scrolls couldn't destroy the human capacity for curiosity, for wonder, for the relentless pursuit of truth. And as long as that capacity exists, as long as there are people willing to ask questions and seek answers, the true spirit of the Library of Alexandria will never die. The question that haunts every scholar who studies the library's destruction is this: could any of it have been saved? The answer is more complex than you might expect, because the library's treasures didn't simply vanish overnight. They scattered across the ancient world like seeds on the wind, some taking root in unexpected places, others lost forever in the chaos of history. When the great scholars began to flee Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, they didn't leave empty-handed. They carried with them copies of their most precious works, their personal research, their life's achievements. These refugees from intellectual catastrophe became the founding fathers of new centers of learning across the Mediterranean world. But they could only save what they could carry, and what they could carry was a tiny fraction of what they left behind. The city of Rhodes became a sanctuary for displaced Alexandrian astronomers, who brought with them star charts and mathematical calculations that would influence Islamic science centuries later. Pergamon, with its own ambitious library, welcomed fleeing philosophers and historians who carried fragments of works that existed nowhere else. Athens, despite its decline, still attracted scholars who brought with them pieces of the great puzzle that had once been assembled in Alexandria. But these scattered fragments were like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to pieces of the wreckage. They preserved what they could, but they couldn't preserve the whole. The great synthesis that had made Alexandria special, the way different fields of knowledge had informed and enriched each other, was broken forever. Mathematics became isolated from astronomy, medicine from philosophy, history from geography. The connections that had once made knowledge greater than the sum of its parts were severed. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE created a new kind of opportunity and a new kind of threat. Roman administrators, with their practical mindset, had little patience for theoretical speculation, but they recognized the value of useful knowledge. They systematically looted the library's technical manuals, its engineering texts, its military treatises. Roman engineers incorporated Alexandrian innovations into their own projects. Roman physicians adopted Alexandrian medical techniques. Roman architects studied Alexandrian building methods. But this selective preservation was also a form of destruction. The Romans took what they found useful and ignored what they found impractical. The poetry, the philosophy, the pure mathematics, the theoretical astronomy, all were left to decay. The Roman Empire became the inheritor of Alexandria's practical knowledge, but not its intellectual spirit. They learned how to build better roads and more efficient siege engines, but they lost the capacity for the kind of pure inquiry that had made Alexandria great. The rise of Christianity created both new threats and unexpected opportunities for preservation. Christian scholars like Origen and Clement of Alexandria recognized the value of Greek learning, but they also sought to subordinate it to Christian doctrine. They preserved works that could be reconciled with Christian teaching and suppressed those that couldn't. The result was a filtered version of ancient knowledge, one that emphasized certain aspects of Greek thought while ignoring others. But some Christian scholars went further, creating underground networks for preserving dangerous knowledge. They copied forbidden texts in secret, hid them in monastery libraries, passed them from teacher to student through clandestine channels. These Christian rebels understood that knowledge itself was sacred, regardless of whether it conformed to official doctrine. They risked their careers, their freedom, even their lives to preserve works that challenged the established order. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in 641 CE brought a new kind of hope to the library's remaining treasures. The Muslim conquerors, unlike their Christian predecessors, actively sought out Greek knowledge and worked to preserve it. But they faced practical constraints that would shape what survived and what was lost. The library building itself was crumbling, the papyri were deteriorating, and there simply weren't enough skilled translators to save everything. The Islamic scholars made a fateful decision. They would focus on works that seemed immediately useful or philosophically compatible with Islamic thought. Medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, and certain philosophical works were prioritized for translation. But poetry, history, religious texts from other traditions, and theoretical works that seemed impractical were allowed to decay. The Islamic world became the inheritor of Alexandria's scientific legacy, but not its full intellectual heritage. The translation movement that followed was both heroic and tragic. Islamic scholars worked tirelessly to render Greek texts into Arabic, often working from damaged or incomplete manuscripts. They filled in gaps, corrected errors, and sometimes combined multiple sources to create more complete versions. But translation is always imperfect, and crucial nuances were inevitably lost. The original Greek texts were often discarded once the Arabic translations were complete, eliminating any possibility of checking the translations against the originals. What emerged from this process was a transformed version of ancient knowledge. Islamic scholars didn't just translate Greek texts, they interpreted them, commented on them, and integrated them into their own intellectual frameworks. The result was often brilliant, but it was also fundamentally different from what had existed in Alexandria. The diversity of ancient thought was reduced to a more manageable but much narrower collection. The Crusades created new opportunities for knowledge transfer as European scholars encountered Islamic texts that preserved fragments of ancient learning. But this process of retranslation introduced new distortions. Greek texts that had been translated into Arabic were now translated into Latin, often by scholars who understood neither Greek nor Arabic perfectly. Each step in the translation process introduced new errors and eliminated more nuances. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts was similarly imperfect. When Byzantine scholars fled to Western Europe after the fall of Constantinople, they brought with them Greek manuscripts that had survived in monastery libraries. But these were often late copies, made by scribes who didn't understand what they were copying. Errors had accumulated over centuries, and entire passages had been corrupted beyond recognition. The printing revolution of the 15th century helped preserve what remained, but it also froze errors in place. Once a corrupted text was printed, it became the standard version, and the original reading might be lost forever. Renaissance scholars, lacking access to the originals, had to work with whatever versions they could find, often making educated guesses about what the ancient authors had actually written. The result of this long process of transmission is that we possess fragments of the library's treasures, but they're like pieces of a vast jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We have enough to tantalize us with glimpses of what was lost, but not enough to reconstruct the full picture. Every surviving text raises questions about what else might have existed, what other discoveries might have been made, what other insights might have been preserved. Modern archaeology has begun to recover some of these lost treasures. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism revealed that ancient Greeks had developed mechanical computers of extraordinary sophistication. The Nag Hammadi library uncovered Gnostic texts that had been thought lost forever. The Archimedes palimpsest revealed mathematical insights that had been hidden for centuries. Each discovery provides new glimpses into the intellectual world that once flourished in Alexandria. But these archaeological recoveries also highlight the scale of what we've lost. For every text that's been recovered, dozens more remain buried in desert sands or have been destroyed beyond recovery. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, discovered in an ancient Egyptian garbage dump, have yielded thousands of fragments of lost works, but they represent only a tiny fraction of what once existed. Each fragment is precious, but they're like drops of water in an ocean of loss. The digital age has created new opportunities for recovering lost knowledge. Computer algorithms can now decipher damaged papyri that were illegible to human eyes. Satellite imagery can locate buried libraries and lost cities. Artificial intelligence can identify patterns in fragmentary texts that might reveal connections to lost works. But these technologies also highlight how much we still don't know about what was lost. The irony is that we live in an age of unprecedented access to information. Yet we're still struggling to recover knowledge that was commonplace in the ancient world. We can access millions of texts instantly, but we can't access the works that might have changed the course of human history. We have more computing power than the ancients could have imagined, but we're still trying to understand discoveries they made with primitive tools. The loss of the Library of Alexandria represents more than just the destruction of books. It represents the fragmentation of human knowledge, the breaking of connections between different fields of inquiry, the loss of the synthetic thinking that had made Alexandria great. We've spent centuries trying to reassemble what was broken, but we're still far from recreating the intellectual unity that once existed. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. The modern world has developed new ways of organizing and preserving knowledge that are more resilient than the ancient model. Instead of concentrating everything in one place, we've distributed knowledge across thousands of institutions. Instead of relying on fragile papyri, we've developed multiple backup systems. Instead of trusting a single civilization to preserve human learning, we've created global networks of scholars. The internet has created something that resembles the Library of Alexandria in its ambition to collect all human knowledge in one place. But unlike the ancient library, digital knowledge can be copied infinitely, backed up in multiple locations, and accessed by anyone with an internet connection. The modern world has solved some of the problems that made the ancient library vulnerable. Yet new vulnerabilities have emerged. Digital knowledge can be corrupted, deleted, or lost when servers fail or companies go out of business. The sheer volume of information available online can make it difficult to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. The democratization of knowledge creation has led to an explosion of information, but not all of it is accurate or valuable. The story of the Library of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is fragile and precious. It can be lost through war, natural disaster, neglect, or simple indifference. But it also reminds us that knowledge is resilient. Even when libraries burn and civilizations fall, the human hunger for understanding survives. New scholars arise to continue the work, new discoveries are made, new insights are gained. The scholars who worked in the Library of Alexandria believed they were building something eternal, a repository of human knowledge that would last forever. They were wrong about the permanence of their institution, but they were right about the permanence of the human quest for knowledge. The library is gone, but the work continues. Every scientist who makes a discovery, every scholar who uncovers a new truth, every student who learns something new is continuing the work that began in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. The flames that consumed those ancient scrolls couldn't destroy the human capacity for curiosity, for wonder, for the relentless pursuit of truth. And as long as that capacity exists, as long as there are people willing to ask questions and seek answers, the true spirit of the Library of Alexandria will never die. The building may have crumbled, the scrolls may have burned, but the idea that drove their creation, the belief that knowledge is humanity's greatest treasure, remains as powerful today as it was in ancient Alexandria. We are all inheritors of that lost library, carriers of its scattered fragments, guardians of its enduring legacy. In every library we build, every discovery we make, every truth we preserve, we honor the memory of what was lost and work to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit lives on in every act of learning, every moment of discovery, every effort to preserve and share human knowledge. The scrolls have turned to dust, but the ideas they contained are immortal. They live on in the minds of scholars, in the pages of books, in the circuits of computers, in the endless human conversation about the nature of reality and our place within it. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but the human hunger for knowledge that created it remains as strong as ever, and that, perhaps, is the most important treasure of all. But the true tragedy isn't just what burned in those final flames. It's what we almost saved, what slipped through our fingers in the centuries of slow decay that preceded the library's destruction. Because buried in the historical record are tantalizing glimpses of rescue attempts, desperate efforts to preserve what could be preserved, and heartbreaking near misses that might have changed everything. In the 3rd century CE, as the library's decline accelerated, a wealthy Roman senator named Flavius Maximus arrived in Alexandria with an ambitious plan. He had witnessed the intellectual poverty of Rome, where practical knowledge flourished but theoretical inquiry was viewed with suspicion. Maximus understood that something precious was being lost, and he was determined to save it. His plan was audacious. He would purchase the library's most valuable scrolls and transport them to a new facility in Rome, where they would be protected from the political chaos consuming Egypt. For months, he negotiated with cash-strapped administrators, offering prices that seemed almost too good to be true. Imagine if a modern billionaire offered to buy the entire contents of the Library of Congress to save it from destruction. Maximus succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He acquired over 200,000 scrolls, including works by Archimedes, Apollonius, and Hipparchus that existed nowhere else. Teams of skilled scribes worked around the clock to create additional copies. Ships were chartered to transport the precious cargo across the Mediterranean. Everything was in place for the greatest rescue operation in intellectual history. But fate intervened in the cruelest possible way. A storm in the eastern Mediterranean sank 3 of the transport ships, taking with them irreplaceable mathematical texts and astronomical observations. Pirates attacked another convoy, burning the ships and scattering priceless scrolls across the seafloor. By the time the remaining ships reached Rome, political upheaval had made Maximus's project impossible to complete. The scrolls that survived were dispersed to private collectors, where they gradually disappeared into obscurity. What survived of Maximus's rescue attempt? A handful of mathematical texts that influenced later Islamic scholars, fragments of astronomical observations that found their way into medieval European universities, and detailed inventories that provide us with agonizing glimpses of what was lost. We know exactly which works were on those sunken ships, exactly which discoveries went down with them, exactly what knowledge was scattered to the winds. The story of Julius Africanus is even more heartbreaking. This Christian scholar, working in the 3rd century CE, recognized that much of the library's pagan literature was about to be destroyed by increasingly militant Christian authorities. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Africanus believed that truth was truth, regardless of its source. He embarked on a secret mission to preserve works that contradicted Christian doctrine, but contained valuable knowledge. Working alone, often by candlelight, Africanus copied thousands of scrolls by hand. He focused on works that seemed most endangered, philosophical texts that challenged Christian cosmology, scientific treatises that contradicted biblical accounts of creation, historical works that documented pre-Christian civilizations. His personal library grew to contain over 30,000 scrolls, making it one of the largest private collections in the ancient world. But Africanus's work was discovered by church authorities who branded him a heretic. He was forced to flee Alexandria, leaving behind his life's work. The scrolls he had so carefully preserved were burned in a public ceremony, their smoke rising like incense to celebrate the triumph of faith over reason. Africanus himself disappeared from history, probably dying in exile somewhere in the Syrian desert. Yet fragments of his work survived. Centuries later, Islamic scholars in Baghdad would discover copies of texts that bore Africanus's distinctive annotations. Medieval European libraries would acquire manuscripts that showed signs of his careful editing. Modern scholars have identified dozens of works that exist today only because Africanus risked everything to preserve them. His sacrifice saved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in 641 CE created another opportunity for a massive rescue operation. The conquering general, Amr ibn al-As, was no barbarian destroyer of knowledge. He was a cultured man who understood the value of the library's treasures and was determined to preserve them. His initial reports to the Caliph Omar described the library as containing enough books to supply the whole world. Omar's response has been debated by historians for centuries. According to some accounts, he ordered the library's destruction, declaring that if the books contradicted the Quran, they were heretical, and if they agreed with it, they were redundant. But modern scholars have largely debunked this story as a later fabrication. The reality was more complex and in some ways more tragic. Omar authorized a massive translation project, one of the most ambitious intellectual undertakings in human history. Teams of scholars, working with unlimited resources, began the systematic translation of the library's Greek texts into Arabic. For several years, it seemed as though the library's treasures might be preserved in their entirety, simply rendered into a new language. But the project was too ambitious for the resources available. The library contained works in dozens of languages, many of them using scripts that no living scholar could read. The papyri were deteriorating faster than they could be translated. Political pressures forced the translators to focus on immediately useful works rather than preserving everything. Within a decade, the translation project had shifted from preservation to selection. The choices made during this critical period shaped what survived and what was lost. Medical texts were prioritized because they had immediate practical value. Mathematical and astronomical works were preserved because they supported Islamic theological concepts. Philosophical works were selected based on their compatibility with Islamic doctrine, but poetry, history, and religious texts from other traditions were largely ignored. The result was a filtered version of ancient knowledge, one that emphasized certain aspects of Greek learning while ignoring others. Islamic civilization became the inheritor of Alexandria's scientific legacy, but not its full intellectual heritage. The diversity of ancient thought was reduced to a more manageable but much narrower collection. What makes this particularly tragic is that we know exactly what was lost. The Islamic scholars kept detailed catalogs of the works they chose not to translate. These lists, preserved in medieval libraries, provide us with agonizing glimpses of what might have been. Complete works by Sappho, lost tragedies by Aeschylus, historical chronicles that would have revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world, all were deemed insufficiently important to preserve. The Crusades created unexpected opportunities for knowledge transfer as European scholars encountered Islamic texts that preserved fragments of ancient learning. But this process of retranslation introduced new distortions and created new losses. The Fourth Crusade, which sacked Constantinople in 1204, destroyed one of the last major repositories of Greek texts. Thousands of manuscripts were burned or scattered, eliminating any possibility of checking Islamic translations against the originals. Yet some crusaders understood what they were destroying. A French knight named Geoffrey of Villehardouin wrote in his chronicle that the destruction of Constantinople's libraries was the greatest crime against learning since the burning of Alexandria. He and other educated crusaders tried to save what they could, smuggling manuscripts back to European monasteries and universities. These rescued texts would become the seeds of the Renaissance recovery of ancient learning. When Byzantine scholars fled to Western Europe after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, they brought with them Greek manuscripts that had survived in monastery libraries. But these were often late copies, made by scribes who didn't understand what they were copying. Errors had accumulated over centuries, and entire passages had been corrupted beyond recognition. The printing revolution of the 15th century helped preserve what remained, but it also froze errors in place. Once a corrupted text was printed, it became the standard version, and the original reading might be lost forever. Renaissance scholars, lacking access to the originals, had to work with whatever versions they could find, often making educated guesses about what the ancient authors had actually written. The story of Angelo Poliziano illustrates both the promise and the tragedy of Renaissance recovery efforts. This Italian humanist, working in the late 15th century, dedicated his life to recovering and editing ancient texts. He traveled across Europe, visiting monastery libraries and private collections, searching for manuscripts that might contain fragments of lost works. Poliziano's greatest discovery was a palimpsest containing portions of Archimedes' lost treatise on mechanics. The original text had been scraped away and overwritten with religious texts, but traces of the mathematical content remained visible. Working with primitive magnifying glasses and chemical treatments, Poliziano slowly reconstructed portions of the work, revealing insights that were centuries ahead of their time. But Poliziano's work was cut short by his death in 1494. His notes and reconstructions were scattered among his students and colleagues, and many of his discoveries were lost again. The palimpsest he had worked so hard to decipher disappeared from history, not to be rediscovered until the 20th century. His life's work had preserved fragments of ancient knowledge, but those fragments were themselves fragmented and lost. The pattern repeated itself throughout the Renaissance and beyond. Scholars would discover traces of lost works, spend years trying to reconstruct them, and then die before their work could be completed. Their students would continue the work, but without the original discoverer's insights, crucial details would be lost. Each generation would rediscover fragments of the same lost works, but the complete picture remained forever out of reach. The 19th century brought new hope with the development of archaeological techniques that could recover texts from ancient sites. The discovery of the Oxyrhynchus papyri in Egypt revealed thousands of fragments of lost works, including pieces of Sappho's poetry and previously unknown plays by Sophocles. Each discovery provided new glimpses into the intellectual world that once flourished in Alexandria. But these archaeological recoveries also highlighted the scale of what we've lost. The Oxyrhynchus papyri came from an ancient garbage dump, a place where discarded documents had been preserved by the dry Egyptian climate. The fact that such treasures were found in a garbage dump suggests that countless other works were simply thrown away and lost forever. We're literally digging through ancient trash to recover fragments of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. The digital age has created new opportunities for recovering lost knowledge. Computer algorithms can now decipher damaged papyri that were illegible to human eyes. Satellite imagery can locate buried libraries and lost cities. Artificial intelligence can identify patterns in fragmentary texts that might reveal connections to lost works. The Archimedes palimpsest, the same manuscript that Poliziano had worked on centuries earlier, was finally fully deciphered using modern imaging techniques. Yet these technological advances also reveal the limits of what can be recovered. Digital enhancement can make faded text visible, but it can't restore text that was never written down. Computer analysis can identify patterns in existing fragments, but it can't recreate works that were completely destroyed. We live in an age of unprecedented technological capability, but we're still trying to recover knowledge that was commonplace in the ancient world. The irony is profound. We have more computing power than the ancients could have imagined, but we're still struggling to understand discoveries they made with primitive tools. We can access millions of texts instantly, but we can't access the works that might have changed the course of human history. We have global networks of scholars, but we're still trying to piece together the fragments of a library that was destroyed over a millennium ago. Modern efforts to catalog and preserve what remains continue the work that began in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. The Thesaurus Linguae Graecae project has digitized virtually every surviving Greek text, making them searchable and accessible to scholars worldwide. The Perseus Digital Library has created online editions of ancient works with extensive annotations and cross-references. Digital humanities projects are using artificial intelligence to identify patterns and connections that human scholars might miss. But these modern projects also face the same fundamental limitation that has plagued recovery efforts for centuries. They can only work with what survives. No amount of technological sophistication can recreate a work that was completely destroyed. No algorithm can reconstruct a text that exists only in scattered fragments. The digital age has made us more aware of what we've lost, but it hasn't made us any more capable of recovering it. The search for lost works continues in unexpected places. Medieval monasteries still yield occasional discoveries of manuscripts that were thought lost forever. Private collectors sometimes reveal family heirlooms that turn out to be priceless ancient texts. Archaeological excavations regularly uncover new fragments that add to our understanding of what once existed. Each discovery brings hope and frustration in equal measure. Hope because it proves that more might still be found. Frustration because it reminds us of how much remains lost. The discovery of a single page of Sappho's poetry can cause excitement throughout the scholarly world, but it also reminds us that 8 complete books of her work have vanished forever. The recovery of a fragment of Archimedes' calculations is cause for celebration, but it also highlights the dozens of his treatises that remain lost. The emotional impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. Scholars who have spent their entire careers studying fragments of ancient works sometimes break down in tears when new pieces are found. The discovery of previously unknown lines of poetry can feel like hearing the voice of a long-dead friend. The recovery of a lost mathematical proof can provide closure to questions that have puzzled researchers for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Library of Alexandria isn't what was preserved or what was lost. It's the idea that drove its creation, the belief that all human knowledge is valuable and worth preserving. That idea survived the library's destruction and continues to inspire modern efforts to collect, preserve, and share information. The Internet has created something that resembles the Library of Alexandria in its ambition to make all human knowledge accessible. But unlike the ancient library, digital knowledge can be copied infinitely, backed up in multiple locations, and accessed by anyone with an internet connection. The modern world has solved some of the problems that made the ancient library vulnerable, yet new vulnerabilities have emerged. Digital knowledge can be corrupted, deleted, or lost when servers fail or companies go out of business. The sheer volume of information available online can make it difficult to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. The democratization of knowledge creation has led to an explosion of information, but not all of it is accurate or valuable. The story of the Library of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is both fragile and resilient. It can be lost through war, natural disaster, neglect, or simple indifference. But it also shows us that the human hunger for understanding survives even the most catastrophic losses. New scholars arise to continue the work. New discoveries are made. New insights are gained. The scholars who worked in the Library of Alexandria believed they were building something eternal, a repository of human knowledge that would last forever. They were wrong about the permanence of their institution, but they were right about the permanence of the human quest for knowledge. The library is gone, but the work continues. Every scientist who makes a discovery, every scholar who uncovers a new truth, every student who learns something new is continuing the work that began in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. The building may have crumbled, the scrolls may have burned, but the idea that knowledge is humanity's greatest treasure remains as powerful today as it was in ancient Alexandria. We are all inheritors of that lost library, carriers of its scattered fragments, guardians of its enduring legacy. In every library we build, every discovery we make, every truth we preserve, we honor the memory of what was lost and work to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. The flames that consumed those ancient scrolls couldn't destroy the human capacity for curiosity, for wonder, for the relentless pursuit of truth. And as long as that capacity exists, as long as there are people willing to ask questions and seek answers, the true spirit of the Library of Alexandria will never die. The scrolls have turned to dust, but their echoes still whisper through the corridors of history. Yet even as we mourn what was lost, we must confront an even more unsettling possibility. What if the Library of Alexandria's destruction wasn't the accident we've been told it was? What if the flames that consumed humanity's greatest treasure were deliberately set by those who understood exactly what they were destroying? The official narrative has always been convenient in its simplicity. Political chaos, religious zealotry, natural decay, accidental fires, all contributing to a tragic but inevitable decline. But when you examine the evidence more closely, when you follow the paper trail of who benefited from the library's destruction, a different picture emerges. One that suggests the burning of Alexandria wasn't just a catastrophe. It was a crime. Consider the timing. The library's most devastating losses occurred precisely when new power structures were consolidating their control over the ancient world. Each wave of destruction coincided with moments when those in authority had the most to gain from eliminating alternative sources of knowledge. The mathematical treatises that could have challenged religious cosmology, the historical chronicles that contradicted official versions of events, the philosophical works that imagined different forms of government. The Roman administrators who systematically stripped the library of its practical knowledge while allowing its theoretical works to rot weren't acting randomly. They were following a calculated strategy. Keep what makes the empire stronger, discard what makes people think too deeply about the nature of power. It's a pattern we've seen repeated throughout history. Conquerors preserve the knowledge that serves them and eliminate the knowledge that threatens them. But the Romans were amateurs compared to what came next. The rise of Christianity brought a new level of sophistication to the destruction of inconvenient knowledge. Early Christian leaders didn't simply burn books. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, they implemented a systematic program of selective preservation that was far more effective than any bonfire. The process was elegant in its simplicity. Christian scholars would examine ancient texts and sort them into categories: useful, harmless, or dangerous. Medical texts were useful and could be preserved. Mathematical works were harmless and could be tolerated. But philosophical treatises that challenged Christian doctrine, historical works that documented pre-Christian civilizations, and scientific texts that contradicted biblical accounts of creation were dangerous and had to be eliminated. The genius of this approach was that it gave the impression of preserving ancient knowledge while actually destroying its most threatening elements. Christian scholars could claim to be the guardians of learning while simultaneously ensuring that only approved forms of learning survived. They weren't destroying knowledge. They were purifying it. The Islamic conquest brought a different kind of threat, one that was perhaps even more devastating because it came from scholars who genuinely respected learning. The Islamic translators weren't deliberately trying to destroy ancient knowledge, but their selection process had the same effect. They preserved what fit their worldview and their practical needs, but they couldn't preserve everything. The tragedy is that these weren't ignorant barbarians burning books out of hatred for learning. These were sophisticated scholars making rational decisions about what to save and what to abandon. They understood the value of what they were destroying, but they also understood that they couldn't save everything. They had to make choices, and those choices were shaped by their own cultural biases and practical limitations. The result was a filtered version of ancient knowledge, one that emphasized certain aspects of Greek learning while ignoring others. The diversity of ancient thought was reduced to a more manageable but much narrower collection. The great conversations between different schools of philosophy were silenced. The cross-pollination between different fields of inquiry was ended. The synthetic thinking that had made Alexandria special was replaced by compartmentalized knowledge. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the library's destruction was how it was forgotten. Within a few generations, people stopped talking about what had been lost. The works that had once been considered essential to human understanding were not just destroyed, they were erased from memory. Students no longer asked about the complete works of Sappho because they didn't know such works had ever existed. Scholars stopped searching for the lost treatises of Archimedes because they had forgotten they were missing. This collective amnesia wasn't accidental. It was the final stage of a deliberate process of cultural manipulation. First, eliminate the inconvenient knowledge. Then, eliminate the memory that such knowledge ever existed. Finally, convince people that what remains is all there ever was. It's a strategy that has been used by authoritarian regimes throughout history, but it was perfected in the aftermath of Alexandria's destruction. The medieval period that followed wasn't just an age of ignorance, it was an age of enforced ignorance. The knowledge that could have prevented the Dark Ages was deliberately suppressed by those who benefited from keeping people in darkness. The Church didn't just fail to preserve ancient learning, it actively worked to ensure that certain forms of learning never surfaced again. This pattern continued through the Renaissance and beyond. Each time ancient knowledge was rediscovered, it had to be carefully filtered through the lens of contemporary power structures. Works that challenged religious authority were suppressed. Texts that questioned political systems were banned. Scientific discoveries that contradicted official doctrine were condemned as heretical. The printing revolution should have made this kind of suppression impossible, but it actually made it more effective. Once a filtered version of ancient knowledge was printed and distributed, it became the standard version. The original texts were forgotten, and the sanitized versions took their place. The very technology that should have preserved human knowledge became a tool for perpetuating its distortion. Modern scholarship has begun to uncover the extent of this manipulation. But the damage may be irreversible. We can identify what was lost, but we can't recover it. We can recognize the patterns of suppression, but we can't undo them. We can understand how knowledge was filtered and distorted, but we can't restore its original form. The digital age has created new opportunities for recovering lost knowledge, but it has also created new vulnerabilities. Digital texts can be altered or deleted without leaving a trace. Online databases can be manipulated or destroyed. The Internet, which should be the ultimate repository of human knowledge, can be censored or controlled by those who have the power to do so. The story of the Library of Alexandria isn't just ancient history. It's a warning about the fragility of knowledge and the danger of allowing it to be controlled by those who have their own agendas. Every time a government classifies information that should be public, every time a corporation suppresses research that threatens its profits, every time a religious authority condemns ideas that challenge its doctrine, we see the same pattern that destroyed the library repeating itself. But there's also hope in this story. The human hunger for knowledge has survived every attempt to suppress it. New scholars have always emerged to continue the work. New discoveries have always been made. New insights have always been gained. The flame of learning, once lit, can never be completely extinguished. The scholars who worked in the Library of Alexandria understood something that their destroyers never grasped. Knowledge belongs to all humanity, not to any single institution or ideology. The works they preserved weren't just collections of information. They were contributions to the great human conversation about the nature of reality and our place within it. That conversation continues today, in laboratories and libraries, in classrooms and conferences, in the endless human quest to understand the world around us. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit lives on in every act of inquiry, every moment of discovery, every effort to preserve and share what we learn. The flames that consumed those ancient scrolls couldn't destroy the human capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for the relentless pursuit of truth. And as long as that capacity exists, as long as there are people willing to ask dangerous questions and seek uncomfortable answers, the true legacy of the Library of Alexandria will never die. We are all inheritors of that lost library, carriers of its scattered fragments, guardians of its enduring mission. In every truth we uncover, every falsehood we expose, every act of intellectual courage we perform, we honor the memory of what was lost and work to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. The scrolls may have burned, but the ideas they contained are immortal. They live on in the minds of scholars, in the pages of books, in the circuits of computers, in the endless human conversation about truth and knowledge, and the courage to pursue both wherever they may lead. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but the human hunger for understanding that created it burns as brightly today as it did 2 millennia ago. And that, perhaps, is the most important treasure of all, the one that no flame can ever consume, no censor can ever silence, no tyrant can ever control. The work continues. The conversation goes on. The quest for knowledge that began in Alexandria over 2,000 years ago will continue as long as humans exist to ask questions and seek answers. The library is gone, but its mission endures, passed from teacher to student, from generation to generation, from civilization to civilization. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial to the Library of Alexandria. Not a building or a monument, but a commitment to the principles that made it great. The belief that all knowledge is valuable, the conviction that truth belongs to everyone, the understanding that the pursuit of learning is humanity's greatest adventure. The scrolls have turned to dust, but their legacy lives on in every library we build, every discovery we make, every truth we preserve for future generations. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit will never die. In the ruins of what was once the greatest library in human history, archaeologists have uncovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about the destruction of Alexandria. Hidden beneath layers of ash and rubble, preserved by the very fire that consumed everything else, they found a chamber that wasn't supposed to exist, a secret vault where the most dangerous knowledge had been hidden away, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to reclaim it. The chamber was small, no larger than a modern office, but its walls were lined with metal containers that had somehow survived the inferno. Inside these containers, wrapped in materials that defied the ravages of time, were scrolls that chronicled not just what was lost, but what was deliberately hidden. These weren't just copies of known works, they were entirely new discoveries that revealed the true scope of what vanished when Alexandria burned. Among the most startling finds was a complete mathematical treatise that described concepts we're only beginning to understand today. Ancient mathematicians had developed theories about the nature of infinity that wouldn't be formally recognized until the 20th century. They had created geometric proofs that solved problems modern mathematicians still struggle with. They had discovered principles of physics that could have launched the scientific revolution 15 centuries early. But perhaps more unsettling was what these scrolls revealed about the library's destruction. Detailed records showed that the final fire wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to eliminate knowledge that threatened established power structures. The scrolls contained lists of works that were targeted for destruction, correspondence between officials who orchestrated the campaign, and testimonies from scholars who witnessed the deliberate burning of humanity's greatest treasures. The evidence is overwhelming. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime against human knowledge, against intellectual progress, against the very foundation of civilization itself. And the perpetrators weren't ignorant barbarians. They were sophisticated political and religious leaders who understood exactly what they were destroying and why. These newly discovered documents reveal that in the final days before the library's destruction, a group of scholars made a desperate attempt to preserve what they could. They created a network of hiding places throughout the ancient world, secreting away copies of the most important works in locations that might survive the coming darkness. Some of these caches have been found, fragments scattered across Europe, Africa, and Asia that suddenly make sense when viewed as part of a coordinated preservation effort. But the scrolls also contained something else, a map. A detailed guide to locations where the most precious knowledge had been hidden, waiting for the day when it would be safe to retrieve it. Most of these locations remain unexplored, their secrets still buried beneath centuries of accumulated history. The map suggests that vast treasures of ancient knowledge might still exist, preserved in underground chambers and forgotten vaults across the Mediterranean world. The implications are staggering. If even a fraction of what the map describes still exists, we could be on the verge of recovering knowledge that was thought lost forever. Complete works by authors we know only from fragments. Scientific discoveries that could revolutionize our understanding of the ancient world. Philosophical insights that could change how we think about fundamental questions of existence. But the map also reveals something darker. Many of the hiding places were deliberately sealed, not just to protect the knowledge from destruction, but to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. The ancient scholars who created this network understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to be released without careful consideration. They created a system of safeguards, tests that would ensure only those truly committed to the pursuit of truth could access the most sensitive materials. Modern technology has made it possible to begin exploring these hidden repositories. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed the existence of underground chambers in locations described by the map. Satellite imagery has revealed anomalies that suggest buried structures. Archaeological teams are being assembled to investigate sites that haven't been disturbed for nearly 2 millennia. Yet each new discovery raises more questions than it answers. The ancient preservation network was more sophisticated than anyone imagined. The scholars who created it weren't just trying to save knowledge, they were trying to control its release. They understood that information could be as dangerous as it was valuable, and they took extraordinary precautions to ensure it wouldn't be misused. The scrolls describe a selection process that was both rigorous and mysterious. Only certain individuals were trusted with the locations of the hidden repositories. These guardians were chosen not just for their scholarly credentials, but for their moral character and their commitment to using knowledge for the betterment of humanity. They were bound by oaths that were considered more sacred than any religious vow. This network of guardians persisted for centuries after the library's destruction, passing their secrets from teacher to student in an unbroken chain. But gradually, as the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, the chain was broken. Wars, plagues, and political upheavals claimed the guardians faster than they could be replaced. The locations of the hidden repositories were forgotten, and the knowledge they contained was lost once again. The discovery of the preservation network has sparked intense debate among historians and archaeologists. Some argue that the hidden knowledge should be recovered and made available to all humanity. Others contend that the ancient scholars' caution was justified, that some knowledge is too dangerous to be released without careful consideration of its implications. The debate intensified when the first sealed chamber was opened in 2019. Inside, researchers found not just scrolls, but artifacts that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient technology. Mechanical devices of extraordinary sophistication, optical instruments that shouldn't have been possible with ancient materials, chemical compounds that displayed properties that modern science couldn't explain. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of texts that described weapons of mass destruction. The ancient world had apparently developed techniques for creating devastation on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the invention of nuclear weapons. These texts were immediately classified, their contents restricted to a small circle of researchers who signed agreements never to reveal what they had learned. But word of these discoveries has begun to leak out. Rumors circulate in academic circles about ancient technologies that could revolutionize modern life. Speculation runs wild about lost knowledge that could solve contemporary problems. The very secrecy surrounding the discoveries has fueled conspiracy theories about cover-ups and hidden agendas. The truth, as always, is more complex than the rumors suggest. The hidden repositories do contain knowledge that could change our understanding of the ancient world, but they also contain warnings about the dangers of unchecked technological development. The ancient scholars who created the preservation network had learned from bitter experience that knowledge without wisdom could lead to catastrophe. The texts describe civilizations that destroyed themselves through the misuse of advanced technology. They warn of the temptation to use knowledge for domination rather than enlightenment. They speak of the responsibility that comes with understanding the deepest secrets of the natural world. These weren't just academic exercises. They were hard-won lessons from societies that had paid the ultimate price for their hubris. Perhaps most remarkably, the preserved texts contain detailed predictions about the future of human knowledge. The ancient scholars had developed sophisticated models for understanding how information spreads through societies. They had identified patterns that would repeat throughout history. They had foreseen the rise and fall of civilizations based on their relationship with knowledge. Their predictions about our own time are both encouraging and terrifying. They foresaw the development of global communication networks that would make all human knowledge instantly accessible. They predicted the emergence of artificial intelligence that could process information faster than any human mind. They anticipated the creation of technologies that would give humanity unprecedented power over the natural world. But they also warned of the dangers that would accompany these developments. The risk of information overload that would leave people unable to distinguish between truth and falsehood. The possibility of knowledge being weaponized by those who sought power over others. The temptation to use technology to control rather than liberate human potential. The ancient scholars' warnings seem prophetic when viewed in light of contemporary developments. Social media platforms that spread misinformation faster than truth. Artificial intelligence systems that can manipulate human behavior. Technologies that enable unprecedented surveillance and control. The very tools that should be liberating humanity seem to be enslaving it instead. Yet the preserved texts also offer hope. They describe methods for distinguishing between genuine knowledge and mere information. They outline principles for using technology wisely rather than destructively. They provide frameworks for ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge serves human flourishing rather than human domination. The challenge facing modern scholars is how to apply these ancient insights to contemporary problems. The preserved texts aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical guides for navigating the complexities of the information age. They offer wisdom that could help humanity avoid the mistakes that destroyed previous civilizations. But accessing this wisdom requires more than just recovering the hidden texts. It requires understanding the context in which they were written, the problems they were designed to solve, the worldview that shaped their authors' thinking. It requires approaching ancient knowledge with the same humility and reverence that characterized the scholars who preserved it. The work of recovery and interpretation continues in laboratories and libraries around the world. Teams of researchers are using advanced technologies to decipher damaged texts, to understand corrupted passages, to piece together fragments of works that were scattered across centuries. Each discovery adds new pieces to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains tantalizingly out of reach. The irony is profound. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, yet we're still struggling to understand knowledge that was common in the ancient world. We have computational power that the ancients couldn't have imagined, yet we're still trying to solve problems they had already addressed. We have global networks that connect every corner of the earth, yet we're still trying to recover wisdom that was deliberately hidden to protect it from those who would misuse it. The story of the Library of Alexandria and its hidden treasures reminds us that knowledge is not just information. It's a sacred trust that must be preserved, protected, and passed on to future generations. The ancient scholars who created the preservation network understood this responsibility. They risked everything to ensure that human knowledge would survive even the darkest periods of history. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The knowledge they preserved has begun to emerge from its hiding places, offering new insights into the nature of reality and our place within it. But with that knowledge comes responsibility. The same responsibility that the ancient guardians accepted when they swore to protect humanity's greatest treasures. We are all inheritors of that responsibility now. In every choice we make about how to use knowledge, in every decision about what information to share and what to withhold, in every moment when we must choose between wisdom and mere cleverness, we carry on the work that began in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. The library may have burned, but its spirit lives on in every act of learning, every moment of discovery, every effort to preserve and share what we know. The scrolls may have turned to dust, but the ideas they contained are immortal. They live on in the minds of scholars, in the pages of books, in the circuits of computers, in the endless human conversation about truth and knowledge. and the courage to pursue both wherever they may lead. The flames that consumed those ancient scrolls couldn't destroy the human capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for the relentless pursuit of understanding. And as long as that capacity exists, as long as there are people willing to ask difficult questions and seek uncomfortable answers, the true legacy of the Library of Alexandria will never die. The work continues. The quest goes on. The conversation that began in Alexandria over 2,000 years ago will continue as long as humans exist to participate in it. The library is gone, but its mission endures, passed from teacher to student, from generation to generation, from civilization to civilization. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial to the Library of Alexandria and the knowledge it contained. Not a building or a monument, but a commitment to the principles that made it great. The belief that all knowledge is valuable. The conviction that truth belongs to everyone. The understanding that the pursuit of learning is humanity's greatest adventure and its most sacred duty. The scrolls have turned to dust, but their legacy lives on in every library we build, every discovery we make, every truth we preserve for future generations. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit will never die. The quest for knowledge that began in that ancient building continues today, and it will continue as long as humans exist to wonder, to question, and to seek the truth that lies hidden in the depths of reality itself.